Thank you for joining us for either the second or the third class, depending on if you count the video we watched in the first week, where this is on the third chapter of So You Wish to Know All About Economics by Lyndon LaRouche. And I thought we'd start maybe giving one of the answers, one of the answers I had at least to the homework that Frank and Isaiah assigned at the end of the last session. And there's also at the LaRouche Movement site, which I think is available as a link in the emails we're sending out. If you register for that, there's a forum there where that would be an ideal place even to share your answers to the homeworks or the discussion questions. I think we can get, that should, I think, be available in the emails. But this question in particular, I thought there was a nice answer from some of the research I've done that went into it. So it was choose some sort of productive process that has benefited from the advancement of technology and describe at least 3 stages of development. What made possible the changes in energy flux density and or capital intensity in those stages of improvement in production. And if you go to the next slide. So I chose the coal-powered steel production, mostly in the 19th century in the United States. And without going into too much detail, like the first thing was there's development of the anthracite blast furnace. There are these 2 industrial brothers in Philadelphia, the Biddles, one actually went on to become the president of the Second National Bank, I believe, held a contest to try and make a blast furnace that would use anthracite coal instead of bituminous coal, which was prevalent in northeastern Pennsylvania, the anthracite coal. And had a higher energy density in order to improve U.S. steel production, which somebody won that contest with a design, and it sort of, they called it a second Independence Day with this ability to, anybody hear me okay?
Yeah, I hear you. Okay.
Okay, great. All right. There's just a chat coming. Right. Yeah, second Independence Day because it allowed for the United States to have its own real steel manufacturing industry as opposed to being dependent upon British steel. And then there was the development of the Bessemer process later on that involved a sort of cauldron chamber where you had molten steel, which further improved, I think, the tempering of the steel itself. So it'd be kind of a technological improvement where the first one was something of an improvement in energy density and energy flux density because of the higher energy density of the anthracite. And then the third one, which I think is kind of interesting, is more of a downgrading where there was a failure in the anthracite industry to provide capital investment to the industry, which caused then bituminous production to outpace it, even though it was of a lesser energy density that nicely corresponds with the sort of diminishing returns functions that was brought up in that first chapter of the book, where if you only go on energy flux density, you're only going capital investment to the detriment of the other, then there's a point of diminishing returns that you hit, that the anthracite coal industry hit in the early 20th century. And if you go to the next slide, that just shows the relative energy densities of bituminous on the left and the anthracite at the right. If you go to the next slide, then there's just a quote that I'll gloss over a little bit from a local historian that went into this capital investment problem, where, yeah, despite, oops, lost it for me. Oh, yeah. So just to skip a line or two, for example, while the bituminous industry matched improvements in cutting technologies with advances in drilling and blasting, anthracite saw very few such parallels. The percussive puncher used in bituminous at the end of the 19th century was replaced by a chain breast machine early in the new century, to be followed by short wall machines around 1910. Anthracite really utilized these innovations. Then looking specifically at the finances in anthracite, what were they doing instead of capital investment? And it takes a case study of 2 large firms that merged together. When they merged in 1929, they had a total debt of $52 million. By the end of 1940, it was down to $34 million. And by 1951, it was less than $1 million. But the after-tax earnings kind of between that period amounted to $79 million, the great bulk of which was distributed to stockholders and dividends. Meanwhile, the investment in fixed assets amounted to only $17 million in that time. as one consultant put it, it is apparent that the policy pursued was one of reduction of debt and payment of dividends with only a small reinvestment to improve properties. As a consequence, wrote the consultant, present facilities are largely obsolete and in some instances poorly maintained. Even small labor-saving devices have not been purchased and put to use. And I like this example particularly because I think it really cuts at the heart of what you'll hear maybe from maybe Milton Friedman type conservative economic advocates, where they're saying, oh, you should run the government like a business, or like you got to pay off your debt. Like you can't be spending so frivolously. And I think this is the greatest example is like, well, if people actually ran businesses, like certain people are advocating the government to be like, run like a business, those businesses go out of business if you just pay out dividends in, let's say, tax cuts and just pay off your debt and don't have any investment into actual industrial production. But then here we are. I'll pass it back over to Dewey then, who will have the first section of our presentation on this third chapter proper.
Okay, thank you, Kate, for the really great introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation, class number 3 on chapter 3 of our book, The Thermodynamics of Political Economy. You may have at some point have been told about the 3 laws of thermodynamics by someone like this guy. We are going to say no to this guy and his process, his crazy laws of thermodynamics. Let us begin with our new process. We will, instead of having these thermodynamics, let's just, what we have of this, energy cannot be created or destroyed for a spontaneous process. The entropy of the universe increases. Perfect crystal at 0 Kelvin has 0 entropy. We don't need it. Okay, I'm sorry. There was sort of a problem. This is the draft slide. The other one was in the other presentation. But just to define some things, in the book, there's mention of free energy and energy of the system. And here it is. So free energy is the energy that is left over after the energy used up by a machine, the energy of the system, which includes all the energy necessary to make the machine run and all the energy that is lost through the running of the machine. Everything else that is left over in mechanics, we call free energy. Now, for economics, we are going to have these terms apply to our society, our small little society right here, packed away in the mountains, our hypothetical self-contained consolidated agro-industrial enterprise, as illustrated. In our hypothetical self-contained consolidated agro-industrial enterprise, we are going to act as though it is a closed thermodynamic process. It is completely cut off from all other processes, all other sources of energy, all other, towns around it. It is completely self-sufficient. All energy is produced and used within the process. The cost of producing the needed output to keep the enterprise running, including labor cost, including the fuel that is used in the processes, including the food that you have to give to the animals to make them grow and so on, is the energy of the system in this case. And our profits are what we're going to call the free energy. What must we do with this free energy. There's nothing we can do with the free energy and be responsible except bring it back into the system and use that free energy in order to produce more. And so once we have our energy come back into the system, it'll be used by the system, and then we make even more free energy from the system because our self-contained hypothetical agro-industrial enterprise uses energy to produce more energy in all aspects, in all sectors of this tiny village's economy combined. So really, it's a perfect loop where we wind up using up energy and so on in our hypothetical village in order to make more energy that we can use to make more energy. Is life so simple and easy? No. The problem that we run into is that as we bring our free energy and reinvest our profits and reinvest it into the same process here of our enterprise, eventually the free energy that we use in the system, it'll produce less and less, converging upon zero, more free energy. At a point, it will become zero, where we don't produce anything more than what we had putting in. We get out exactly what we put in. But because we live on, land, and we're not always making all of our own coal from our own decomposing animals and so on, then eventually it's actually going to be harder for us to go and get the resources that are required to keep the system running than it is to just shut down the system. At that point, the system collapses, like what Frank and Isaiah's presentation discussed with the fall of Rome. And, I'm not the first person to say this. There's a book that was written called The Limits to Growth, explaining from these people's, the Club of Rome's perspective, why all of this is really inevitable. That if you keep putting all of your energy into producing more energy in the same way, then eventually you're just going to collapse and die. And so the main argument by the Club of Rome is, we're all going to collapse and die. We should just, go and die at some point. They had a disagreement that with us, because if you, like I said, have the same system going where you reintroduce free energy, leftover energy, back into the system to create more energy to reintroduce back into the system forever, then yes, you are eventually going to either reach a point where you cannot grow any more free energy, or where you are making less energy than what it costs to reproduce your society. The system is entropic. It leads to entropy. Things are lost and wasted in this way. But as we already know, the universe is not entropic. It just so happens that this way of doing things is not completely in line with the universe or the principles of the universe. It is a linear model. So this is the limits to growth was written explaining that because if you always do things like this, and then they wrote a bunch of graphs. Got some spaghetti here written by the Club of Rome explaining their prediction that we're all going to die. You see they change some of the numbers, so on. They do number one scenario, then number two scenario, doubling the resources, we would still die. Of course, because if you double the resources, but you keep this process the same, you're only just doubling the resources that you're gonna run out of eventually in a process that runs out of resources. The problem is that they were using the UN and other national and nonprofits, top men in economics model, the Leontief input-output Nobel Prize winning economics model, in which we put our precious few resources through the process of the easy bake oven, and we receive out of it our gross domestic product. And we do this forever. Now, if you were to do this forever, of course, your system, your economy would collapse. If you were running an economy on an easy bake oven forever and you never reinvested into perhaps a regular oven or a nuclear power plant, your economy would not be able to function after a certain point. It's just too inefficient. Too much is wasted. Whoop. Now, we know already that we don't use the same tools now to produce, and we don't use the same fuels now to power our enterprises that we did a long time ago. The reason is because our society and our species does not operate on these linear models like so. We expand and reproduce, and we do not do so based on just, an input and output. We have access to things beyond this 2D or 1D actually map of an economy. So even though he won a Nobel Prize, this linear way of thinking is not going to save humanity. And it's not what humanity, it's not the principle humanity operates on at all. What if instead of a linear way of thinking, we had maybe a circle or other such shape, or perhaps even a conical way of perceiving our economy? Cade, what do you think about this?
All right, yeah, thank you, Dewey. Yeah, to develop that a little bit more, the consequences of imagining the universe is built upon linear dynamics, as is gone into detail in the correspondence between Gottfried Leibniz and an apologist for Newton, Samuel Clarke, is if you imagine things just happening upon linear dynamics, you end up inevitably in this sort of entropic phenomenon. For Leibniz and Clarke, it was the clockwinder's paradox, that with Newton's model, it would require God to come in every so often and sort of wind up the machine of the universe every so often, or else things would run down to the entropist's absolute zero. And there was a certain ridiculousness in itself of that Leibniz pointed out. In so many words, one way to put it is like, well, well, one, that's just a poor view of God, because then God would be a pretty shoddy. He should be better than any clockmaker. He shouldn't have to come in and rewind things up every so often. But in addition to that, uh, with that entropic linear view, how would we have gotten to where we are now? You could imagine some sort of, satanic pagan creator entity that in some orgiastic burst created like all the free energy that then we're just winding down from. But it seems like there's maybe more in the ability of humanity in the image of God than just as a sort of remnants of some erstwhile explosive force. And so the question then would be, if the universe doesn't wind down that way, then what does it do? And I think it's important here to make reference towards what LaRouche calls a few times throughout this book that we've already seen, that comes up again in this chapter, his curious phenomenon that he's noticed. If you go to the next slide. So this curious phenomenon is the instance in which a mere portion of the total power supplied to a process, by virtue of that portion's being raised to a sufficiently high energy flux density, accomplishes more work than the entire power supplied if the latter is applied at significantly lower energy flux densities. And in sort of reference to the agro and industrial enterprise model that Dewey had presented us earlier, this would be where you avoid just that inevitable winding down to zero, that through technological and scientific discovery and innovation, you bring about productive processes that are able to do more work with less initial energy. And that's where this role of energy flux density comes in. This is the curious phenomenon that just using a fraction of what you would have used previously to produce everything required for society, you'd be able to produce even more so at this greater level of productive powers of labor through in these scientific increases. And if you go to the next slide. So the question would kind of be, how would you get to that, a sort of hypothesis about the universe that would allow you to even notice this kind of curious phenomenon? Or how would you hypothesize what is the essential functioning or form of the universe to be able to produce such a phenomenon, having noticed it? Go to the next slide. And these are some, on the left, this is a diagram from Luca Pacioli's The Divine Proportion. I think in this illustration is by Da Vinci, which was mentioned in the first chapter, again, I believe, where it showed how through their work, they showed that this proportion, which comes from the pentagon and its use in the Platonic solids, is kind of a characteristic of living processes which kind of inherently defy the entropic model to a real degree, that even your standard entropists like Boltzmann and even Schrodinger tried to accommodate for in some way. Like, how do you explain life in an entropic system? And they had fairly faulty theories, but even within their faulty theories, they had to acknowledge there was something of an inherent growth potential in life itself that you can see in this characteristic of the divine proportion, which produces this self-similar sequence then that we'll get into. But if you go to the next slide then. And these are sketches from Johannes Kepler's work, where he was himself trying to look for the reason for the ordering of the planets in the solar system, which was something of the known universe at the time, if I'm being a little loose with that. And in this hypothesizing about the universe, it's an important thing, which will come up a little bit later in what's called the LaRouche-Riemann method, that you need to explain more than just observation. You can't just like fill in all the data gaps of what you observe into some, semi-coherent paint by numbers sketch. There should as well, in any true scientific endeavor, be given the why and wherefore in a principled way that what you observe comes about. And if you go stay on that one too, and Kepler, back on the Kepler diagram still. Kepler, one of his initial hypotheses about the structure of the solar system was this use of the Platonic solids in the ordering of the planets, which proved verifiable to a very real degree, and which really put this golden section from Pacioli as something of an inherent characteristic within the form of the solar system, given the form of the universe at the time. And Kepler's work and hypotheses were later proved valid by Gauss in the way that he predicted the appearance of the asteroid belt before it was known to be, which lined up with his model. And that in just way sort of suggests, well, maybe the universe itself isn't in this wind down phase. Maybe it does have something more of the characteristic of life to it, and has maybe this inherent negentropic characteristic to it. And you can go to the next slide then. And especially if you take that in mind, then there's a kind of question of like, what would be maybe the essential action that forms the universe? If we've seen some of the failures of linear action that produce all these faulty hypotheses from people like the Club of Rome, which like basically like amount to like, oh, I have 3 sandwiches today. If I eat 1 sandwich today, I'll starve in like a week if I eat a sandwich a day. What are some ways of thinking about the composition of space, of physical space, and the action that composes it beyond that of linear action? And one step further than that Dewey mentioned is circular action. A good reference would be Nicholas of Cusa's isoparametric theorem, where he sort of displayed an inherent least action superiority of the form of the circle, or in the impossibility of rectilinear polygons, of just, you know, the impossibility of ever getting a circle by just adding sides to a square, let's say. And so it's not just rhetoric. There's, in what LaRouche calls synthetic geometry, which shows up pretty prominently in this chapter, you can prove definitively that if you take circular action as your starting point, you can reproduce any synthetic geometric theorem brought about through linear action. And then there's a new range of new theorems that you can bring about through circular action as your basis, that advances upon synthetic geometry based on linear action. And further than that, and what some of this chapter goes into, if you remember the sequence of diagrams, self-similar conical spiral action is then another advancement on circular action itself. And hopefully down the line, we can have some rigorous synthetic geometry courses where you can show you this in detail. But as is even mentioned in this chapter, is kind of hitting the highlights of the total picture of the situation. And so, and this is kind of just some bonus stuff that comes up in the self-similar spiral action section, where you have this logarithmic golden spiral applied to a conic or a cone, and where it intersects. If you divide the cone into 12 sections, where the spiral intersects the cone, those ratios produced will actually be equivalent to the harmonic intervals of the chromatic scale. And so generally the question then, as LaRouche poses this, is, at the very least, is a kind of metaphor for the progress that occurs through different stages of economic development, producing these increases in relative potential population density. That this self-similar conical spiral action, it being geometrically superior to circular action, in that it has this growth function inherent in it, whereas it's developing within the cone, you can see this increase. And if you took each sort of section there, the circular section, as you go up, you have this, you could take that as metaphorical for what the relative potential population density would be with that increase in, if you're going up the cone, let's say, as an increase in technological advancement. And if you go to the next slide then. And so this is another kind of bonus thing which shows up more in chapter 6. Like, instead of going into the detail of this whole conic pedagogy, which you could spend a lot of time on, I think just to hit sort of the where it's leading to is what's brought out in the conclusion of the chapter as well, that this focus that work and energy are, as the effect of action and not just sort of static factual magnitudes. and that when they're properly defined, they correspond to realities. This is quoting from the chapter, existing within the continuous manifold corresponding to complex functions not reducible to simple scalar magnitudes. Energy and work are not things, they are processes. And chapter 6 is, I believe, titled Work and Energy. This is the definition given for work and energy just briefly in this chapter, which might seem a little esoteric for now, is that work is considered to be this self-similar conical spiral action, and energy is this self-similar cylindrical spiral action, which we'll leave off maybe for the later chapters. As we go to the next slide, the other thing that this conic pedagogy sort of ends with is this construction of this sort of discrete singularity of negentropic transformation, or this sort of delta volume or quantum of action, which one can imagine as sort of these discrete jump within the productive of powers of labor through increases in capital intensity through technology, or energy flux density through scientific discovery. And you reach at least a sort of conception of what this singularity would be. This sort of, and one of the points of this is that these sort of advancements, it's not some sort of just like gradual, let's say, silent weaving of spirit, as some might say, in the background, where our knowledge just sort of gradually, imperceptibly expands. And so it's at very discrete moments of discovery and innovation where you get these jumps in your productive potential. And if you go to the next slide, just want to give a warning then too, because there's about a paragraph and a half I'm going to read here that just wants to place sort of what's the scope we're dealing with right now that LaRouche says himself, and I think which could maybe set the stage maybe for a more intensive class series to come, which I'd highly recommend. But just to read the quote that I think lays that out for us on the next slide. This conception, which is that conception of the singularity of negentropic action through technology or scientific advancement, so described, defines as a first approximation the implicit topological problem addressed successfully by Dirichlet's principle. This leads in turn directly into Riemann's work, including the mathematical physics program given preliminary statement in Riemann's 1854 habilitation dissertation. The principles of the Riemann surface and the principles underlying the cited 1859 dissertation on acoustical shock waves. The student should master the indicated topics in mathematics through reference to the relevant primary sources of Gauss, Dirichlet, and Riemann. This should be a required feature of the university curriculum in economic science. Without this grounding, an elaborated mathematical application of economic science is not possible. So, and this is just to say, in my opinion at least, that the scope of this book, the point of it, and I think also the point, in my opinion, of this class series, is to give you a nice priming for some deeper work like this, is to give you sort of a conceptual introduction to get the general forms that are being worked with that ground this rigorous economic science. But that, just to build upon Frank and Isaiah's sort of hypothesis from the first week, where they're saying that the point of this class series, and I'd say future class series as well, is to develop the leadership potential of individuals to craft their own economic proposals and advocate for appropriate economic proposals that would lead to the general welfare and betterment of our posterity. That to really get to that creative level requires that sort of intensive study, I'd say, that's lined out in this paragraph here, that we should all look forward to in the upcoming years. If you go to the next slide then. Okay, and sort of the last topic I want to hit in depth from this chapter is kind of this question of what is real? What is like the hard essence of reality? What is the basis for true knowledge, let's say? And one of the images from that conic pedagogical series, I think, displayed it fairly well. Where in figure 4, you have a cone with ellipse, an orbiting point projection image on a plane which represents the sun and an orbiting planet. So you see, this topic is one that comes up fairly often in LaRouche and can be a bit tricky to get a grasp of. So we're going to do the best we can here, but it's in this comparison of what's called a discrete manifold and the continuous manifold. And the discrete manifold, you can imagine as that sort of flat space there with the circular revolution, and imagine that as sort of the space of one's sensorium, of one's direct observations. And then within the cone, and there's actually like very direct ways this relates to continuous manifold, not just in a metaphorical way, in the way that you get these elliptical harmonics and complex functions out of this conic action. But within the cone, what projects from that lower level, from the discrete manifold, from what we observe, the projection of that from the cone, where you could say is the more truthful depiction of what is real, what's going on, is you have this elliptical function, and which would be also representative of the planet orbiting the sun. I think if you go to the next slide, it'll show it a little more directly. And that was one of Kepler's great discoveries, is, you know, the planets did not orbit in circles, they orbit in ellipses, which you could only really be able to hypothesize with this kind of understanding of what LaRouche calls the continuous manifold, where you're going by more than just lining things up with how they appear. Like there's a certain impossibility of actually figuring out how things work by just lining things up with how they appear. Your hypotheses should still be able to explain and correlate to how things appear, but there's always going to be a certain level of reason beyond that. That's sort of the superior space of thought that produces these real effective scientific breakthroughs, which is verifiable when you go to the original works, the primary works of the people who actually made these breakthroughs, such as Kepler. And LaRouche in this chapter relates this all the way back to Plato's allegory of the cave, which some of you may know fairly well, where you have this allegory of people who are chained within a cave and see just the shadows of cutout objects put in front of a flame behind them, and they take the shadows themselves to be the real things. They think the shadows are the real thing. In the same way, if we just go by what we observe in the discrete manifold, so to speak, we in the planet circularly going around the sun, we are going to be stuck at that level of shadows on the wall, where there is a method to have these breakthrough discoveries of the knowledge kind of held in that real, in the continuous manifold. And that method is the LaRouche-Riemann method, as brought up in this chapter as well. So if you could go, I think maybe one more there. And so the LaRouche-Riemann method, it develops from one of the papers mentioned in that long paragraph, which was Riemann's habilitation dissertation, which the title for it was "On the Hypotheses Which Underlie Geometry." And the question would be, what does hypothesis have to do with geometry? Isn't geometry just something you measure and then you see the relations of things, and you can just catalog all these relations of angles and shapes and what so have you? And that's the sort of question Riemann starts with: is geometry just something there for us to observe, or is there something that our mind brings to the realm of geometry through either its implicit or explicit hypothesizing? And so the example he uses is exactly in this development of kind of a Riemannian surface, is the failures of a geometry purely predicated upon like Euclid's axioms, where Euclid, ancient Greek geometrician, had his whole book of elements, which was such a catalog of all the relations of shapes and so forth. But starting from these sort of four axioms, which themselves are never really proven by any means, they're just taken to be the case. And Riemann, in his habilitation dissertation, starts to set up, well, what's beyond those hypotheses of those axioms? What's the sort of space of geometric action and thought that you can go if you develop your hypotheses a bit more? And then what role does that hypothesis have to play in your development of your geometry and your physical principle? And so I'm just going to skip to the bullet point there on the same thing though. So this is just a quote from at the end of the paper, where this discrete and continuous manifold come up into play, with the key point kind of being, if we were just in a discrete manifold, then you could explain everything by Euclidean geometry, but Euclidean geometry doesn't explain everything. So while in a discrete manifold, the principle of metric relations is implicit in the mathematical definition of this manifold. It must come from somewhere else in the case of a continuous manifold. Either then the actual things forming the groundwork of a space must constitute a discrete manifold, or else the basis of metric relations must be sought for outside that mathematical definition. in colligating forces that operate upon it. This path leads us out into the domain of another science, into the realm of physics. So in a sort of corrupted, not exactly classical sense, but at least in the rotten traditions of a lot of physics, there's a certain idea that, you know, a lot of physics is just figuring out the underlying geometry of the physics. And this is kind of flipped by Riemann in his habilitation dissertation, that it's physics itself and the forces of physics and the hypotheses, the scientific hypotheses upon physical action, they more define what our geometry can be in a certain way. And then where we can apply our geometry to our industries and our productive process, that's where it sort of ties back into there. And just to briefly then gloss also, within this Riemann section of the LaRouche-Riemann method, Riemann talks about these invariant characteristics which form the basis for crucial experiments within discrete manifold that reveal truth of the continuous manifold. Like, so since you can't actually like live in the continuous manifold in the cone or whatever, like you are living within your observation to a certain extent, to some degree, maybe we're still chained on that wall. What is the method which would allow for us to still derive the truths of the continuous manifold? And for Riemann, it's these invariant characteristics which, when projected between the continuous and discrete manifold, they remain invariant. They are the same, and you can do certain crucial experiments upon, like Kepler did in his astronomical work, to prove the real in that continuous manifold. And so then to go to the slide beyond, yeah, one more, yep. So, and this is then the key to that curious phenomenon of how you're able to, with an increased technological or scientific capacity, to use just a portion of your previous energy to produce energy beyond what you produced with the full energy before. That it's through these crucial experiments which lead to a greater knowledge of the real, which then can be applied to the productive process. And just to, this is how sort of it's encapsulated by LaRouche towards the end of the section, is this signifies essentially that the definition of matter, substance, not to be attributed to images in the discrete manifold, but only to the real objects of the continuous manifold. The properties attributed to matter must never differ from the definition of matter, exclusively consistent with the mathematical physics of the continuous manifold as such. It is not that sense objects do not correspond to something real, but that the way our minds perceive discreteness of objects in the visible discrete manifold is a distorted perception. In each case, we must find the reality within the continuous manifold, which corresponds to the physical experiences perceived in terms of the discrete manifold. So you have that correlation, but it's this strong polemic against this sort of just static picture of matter, then also, as we said before, and energy and work as just these sort of tabulated things, just these like noun things out there just to like see and index like Pokemon or whatever. And where real development and scientific breakthrough and industrial breakthrough and any kind of breakthrough, artistic breakthrough as well, comes with this tarrying with the principles of physical action that compose this the space of interaction, and not just looking at the things within the space and marking them as A or B or C. And then I don't know what the next slide is. Okay. Do if you want to take back over here, I'd like to say one last remark then, that especially going back to the Club of Rome, it's ridiculous to imagine that you could derive the limits of growth, so to speak, with these purely linear systems of equations. When you see what's brought about in this development of the continuous manifold, which involving these elliptical functions developed through self-similar conical spiral action, it's like the Club of Rome didn't even get to circular action, let alone that sort of conical action needed to really access the Gauss and Riemann's continuous manifold or complex plane. And I don't know, dude, if you want to take over on the last slide here then.
Right. So this is more or less, we've been going chronologically through this chapter right here, which, if it was a sandwich, would have a lot of meat. The one thing we did skip over is there's sort of a short history of the different scientists and mathematicians and philosophers and so on going back and forth on whether we should, like Euclid, treat things as nouns only, or if we should submit to the idea of there being a continuous manifold and seek to understand that in order to advance ourselves here in the discrete manifold that we are looking at. So here, I can't actually read this slide here because of the fact that I have the Zoom thing,
Okay, I could.
the interface for screen sharing. So if you could read that first paragraph at least, Cade, help me out.
Okay, you want me to just do the first paragraph or the 4 bullet points then too?
Do the first paragraph and then, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So this is how LaRouche himself sort of summarizes the essential points of the chapter, and I think we're.
Well, I wrote the first paragraph.
You wrote the first paragraph, okay, yeah.
The list
The
points.
bullet points, yeah. Okay, thus the so-called laws of thermodynamics are false to our negentropic reality. Also, energy and work are not things; they correspond to mathematical processes existing in the continuous manifold. To summarize,
1. The universe as a whole is negentropic, as shown by critical scrutiny of Kepler's laws of astronomy, as by Gauss. 2. The real universe lies ontologically in the continuous manifold, a manifold mathematically explored by a synthetic geometry based on self-similar conical spiral action. The visible world is a distorted projected image of the real world, which exists where that spiral does. 3, the kind of number which corresponds immediately to the reality of the physical world is the form of complex numbers generated by synthetic geometry, constructions in the continuous manifold, the complex domain. The counting numbers are the projections of complex numbers into the visible world. And then finally, knowledge of the physical world is derived from what Riemann defines as unique experiments. And only through increasing our knowledge of the world can we better our station in the world, not simply by just doing more of what we already do. So, Cade, before we end over here, do you have anything else that you have to leave the people with?
No, we have a couple, not that I can think of, a couple of homework and discussion questions here, which will be available up on the class site, I believe, as well, and on that LaRouche movement forum. But I'd be, eager to get to any discussion that people would want to have from the presentation.
Well, I mean, obviously the other homework that LaRouche assigns to us is homework that we can't do until after the whole class series is done, which is to read all of Riemann and all of Kepler and all of Gauss and all of Max Planck and so on. So we are ready, I think, at this point to have the question and answer process. And there really are no stupid questions, especially with this stuff. It's pretty radical by most classroom standards today.
I actually have a question. I have a question. My question is, what is, and I might have missed this part because I'm coming in and out while I'm delivering pizzas, actually, but what is the objective and mathematical difference between a standard manifold and a continuous manifold?
One way, at least Riemann in the habilitation dissertation puts it, and there's different ways to go about it, would be a discrete manifold is something that advances by discrete sections. So like I'm cribbing one of Jason's examples here, like the keys on a piano is a discrete manifold. You know, you can only go up a half step at a time. But something like a continuous manifold would be more representative in something like a cello, where you have a certain, you know, an unfretted string instrument where there's a continuum that, you know, technically you could play any sort of proportionate increment thereof. It's not defined in these discrete half steps like in the keys on a piano.
I see. That makes sense. Okay, that actually perfectly answers my question. Thank you.
You're welcome.